Hello, everyone. How are you? Your mic should be muted as soon as you come in. If they are not, please just put your microphones on mute. The only individuals who will have their mics off are the folks who are speaking, and I'll let them introduce themselves in a quick moment. But I would love to just thank each and every one of you for sharing your afternoon with us. The global shared heritage is near and dear to my heart. When Superintendent Dance brought this information to me and started speaking about the types of legacies that we want to leave behind us, to allow everyone to know that we were here and we were making a difference. It just really made a whole bunch of sense to AAAM. So for those of you who do not know who I am Dr. Vedet Coleman-Robinson, and I am the Executive Director of the Association of African American Museums. For about 3 years, we have partnered with the National Park Service in several different capacities, but definitely since Superintendent Dance has started as the superintendent of Fort Monroe, we have become faster friends than we already were, and started rolling up our sleeves to figure out what types of partnerships we could have that would leave a lasting impact. So Global Shared Heritage was one of them. And before I go any further and not waste, because what I'm saying is important, but before I bore you with any more of my remarks, I am going to pass it over to our wonderful partners over at Park Service so that they can tell you all of the wonderful things that they're working on, and then also introduce you to the panelists. So again, thank you for being here, and just thank you for everything. We really do appreciate you through this African Landing Week. So it's a whole week, y'all. So get ready for everything else that Park Service and everybody has planned for you, because I know you're going to be tired, but it's going to be worth it.
That's right. And so, Vedet, look, with an introduction like that, I had to jump in. I was fully prepared for my colleague and friend, Ajena Rogers, to take the torch and provide the introduction. But I have to acknowledge how important this partnership is with AAAM, with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, with the International National Trust organizations, and the Reimagining International Sites of Enslavement Partnership. I would be remiss if I did not say that right here at the beginning, that the combination of Descendant work, these organizations, and each one of you has really made it possible for us to be here and have this conversation. And so I am just honored, and it's a privilege to be able to do this work with each of you. So now I will pass the torch to Ajena, who will introduce our facilitator today, because we know you all are here to hear from our dear colleagues with the St. Lucia Trust and from Montpelier. And so Ajena, it's all yours.
Thank you, Superintendent Dance. My name is Ajena Rogers, and I am working here as the Supervisory Park Ranger at Fort Monroe, getting the opportunity to work with in this place that is so important to Descendants, who starting from 1619 and going forward, looking at that 400 years of history and looking at how it's shared globally. And so today's symposium about the Descendant community, we're bringing in all kinds of people to share with us their research, their thoughts, their feelings, their connection, and help us all connect. And to help us with that today, we are fortunate and privileged to have Chardae Reed with us. And I want to read a short biography of Chardae Reed, and so then turn it directly over to her. Chardae Reed is a historical archaeology PhD student in William and Mary's Department of Anthropology. Her doctoral research investigates the relationship between archaeological knowledge, production, heritage sites, historical memory, contemporary identities, and restorative justice in Tidewater, Virginia. Results of Chardae's master's thesis research, which explored the complex relationship between making African diaspora history and culture visible at historic Jamestown, were recently published in the International Journal of Historical Archaeology. Before joining William and Mary's anthropology graduate program, Chardae served as the assistant archaeologist of the District of Columbia for 7 years. Her community engaged and interdisciplinary research has previously been recognized with a Mark E. Mack Community Engagement Award 2016, a District of Columbia Awards for Excellence in Historic Preservation for Community Involvement in Education in 2017, and the National Park Service's Appleman Judd Lewis Regional Award for Interdisciplinary Stewardship Team. Currently, she is the co-chair, community side, of the William and Mary Student Assembly's Ad Hoc Committee on Reparations, and a member and group advisor to the Lemon Project, a journey of reconciliation, undergraduate and graduate student volunteer group, the Lemon Project Society. So please, everyone, help me welcome, as our moderator today, Chardae Reed.
Thank you so much, Gina. And it's such a pleasure to be here with so many warm and welcoming faces virtually, even though we are all in different places and spaces. I'm just so glad to see such a wonderful turnout to remember the ancestors and remember this monumental event of African Landing Day in Hampton. So as our warm host at AAAM and at Fort Monroe has already mentioned, I don't want to take too much time. We have these amazing speakers today. So I'm going to get to it. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists today. We will begin first with Dr. Winston Phulgence. Dr. Winston F. Phulgence is the Administrative Dean of Academic Programs at Sir Arthur Lewis Community College in St. Lucia, and the President of the St. Lucia Archaeological and Historical Society. He is a historical anthropologist and holds a BA in History from the University of the West Indies, an MA in Anthropology from the University of Florida, and a PhD in Archaeology from the University of York. A Fulbright Scholar and Marie Curie Research Fellow, his graduate research focused on Caribbean prehistory, history, and heritage management. His dissertation thesis was a comparative study of monuments to commemorate slavery and the regions involved in transatlantic slavery and the slave trade. His research interests include the commemoration of slavery and its legacies and the development of plantation heritage across the contemporary Caribbean. He has published several papers and book chapters, including African Warriors, Insurgent Fighters, and the Memory of Slavery in the Anglophone Caribbean, and Monument Building, Memory Making, and Remembering Slavery in the Contemporary Atlantic World. Welcome, Winston. Next, I would like to introduce Finola Jennings-Clark. Finola Jennings-Clark is a board member of the Cultural Development Foundation in St. Lucia and the counselor of the St. Lucia National Trust, where she currently works as the Business Development and Public Relations Manager. She has a background in design and crafts. After earning degrees and honors in both fields, Finola returned to St. Lucia to work with the government as the Crafts Development Officer and Manager of the Chisola Art and Crafts Center. After leaving the civil service, she branched out to start her own 100% St. Lucian shop and papermaking business, Tafifi Studio. She has also worked as a consultant focusing on local-led innovative solutions in community development, heritage, culture, creative industries, and non-food agriculture. She pursued a master's degree in world heritage and cultural projects for development in Italy, where she wrote a 5-year project to create a cultural tourism district in the quarter of Chuzol, home of St. Lucia's traditional crafts. And you can correct me, Finola, later, please. She is a vocal activist for local rights and inclusive sustainable development, equitable access, and benefits from natural and heritage assets and genuine climate smart approaches to development, especially in the tourism sector. Welcome, Finola. And finally, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Chu. Dr. Elizabeth Chu is the interim president and chief executive officer at James Madison's Montpelier. From 2015 to May 2022, she was executive vice president and chief curator, overseeing the curatorial, education, archaeology, preservation, and research departments and the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution. An art historian, she holds a BA from Yale, an MA from Courtauld Institute of the University of London, and a PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She has worked at museums and historic sites since 1985. As curator at Monticello for 13 years, she researched and implemented projects to interpret women, domestic work, and slavery. She curated the exhibition To Try All Things, Monticello as Experiment, and the David M. Rubenstein Visitor Center, and was co-curator with Rex Ellis of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Of the exposition, Slavery at Jefferson's Monticello, Paradox of Liberty. At Montpelier, she has overseen projects to complete the furnishing of the Madison House and to return slavery to the plantation landscape, including the exhibition, The Mere Distinction of Color, winner of 6 national awards. And if you have not seen that exhibit, I highly, highly recommend it. It is transformative in so many ways. She has taught art history at the University of Virginia, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, James Madison University, Wake Forest University, and Davidson College, and published and lectured widely on ways that art and architectural patronage relate to race, gender, and family politics. Welcome, Elizabeth. Before we begin the roundtable discussion, the panelists will present on their community-driven projects. First up is Dr. Phulgence, and Dr. Chu will present after. So I will turn it over to you, and feel free to either leave your cameras on or turn them off. We will be screen sharing for this portion of the roundtable.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I was told I had 10 minutes, so we have a brief presentation, and thank you for having us here. I was pulled on because the director of National Trust was unable to make it. I hope I could do justice to what she requires of me here. The site that we're looking at is a site in St. Lucia called Mont Fortune. It was a military fort, a fort which had been established by the French, and because the island changed hands so many times, like 14 times, it was controlled by either the French or the British at one point or another. We want to look at this site and give some kind of context to the African diaspora and the forces which created it. St. Lucia is one of the islands in the Caribbean archipelago, in the Eastern Caribbean, sorry, and it's halfway between the group of islands. And that is the reason St. Lucia became so important, not as a plantation colony, but because of its military and strategic importance. If you look at the location in the middle of the Atlantic Eastern Caribbean chain, you can see that anyone who controlled the island at the time would be able to disrupt not only just economic activity, but military activity across the Eastern Caribbean. So the island would be neutral until it was controlled by someone, the British or the French, who wanted to take advantage of its location. Next slide, please. Okay, so if you look at the map here, you can see Mont Fortune, located just outside the city of Castries. The fort was developed to defend the city of Castries, but whoever controlled that fort controlled the entire island. And because the island chain, you could see every island in the chain from the north of another island or from the south. It meant that military observation or reconnaissance could very easily be done from different parts of the island. For example, Mont Fortune, with a good telescope, one can actually surveil what's happening in Martinique, especially with the location of the forts in Martinique. So it made the island very important as a military site. Mont Fortune, next slide, please. Okay, currently, the site is managed by the St. Lucia National Trust. It's a very large site. I think it's almost 7 acres. And that site contains the ruins of several of the occupations of that fort. The fort was first called Mont Fortune by the French and Fort Charlotte by the British. Whoever controlled it controlled the island. Now, if you look across from the picture we're seeing here, as you go in the distance, Martinique is in the distance. So it meant that you can control you could observe what's happening in Martinique as you look forward. Now, next slide, please. Okay, all the military ruins remain on that site. In fact, the site is now occupied by the South Louis Community College because the barracks were there and they were refurbished and became a site for education. However, we still have lots of remnants. What we see here is a British cemetery, the obelisk in the middle, and at the time, military officers and high-ranking people were actually buried at that site. So far, I've spoken about this site as a site of military dealings, but I keep referring to the British and the French. I'm doing this deliberately because what is remembered on that site and the way the site is interpreted actually leads to a lot of silencing of other histories that would have been performed on that site. This is a British cemetery. Let's move to another monument. This is a walkway which leads to another obelisk, but this obelisk was installed in the 1930s. At the end of the last major war in St. Lucia in 1796, the British Enniskillen Regiment, an Irish regiment, actually won the battle and, of course, the war against a group of formerly enslaved St. Lucians who had taken control of the island as far back as 1794. They had fought against the British with French help, of course, and were able to control the island. In 1494, when they took over the island, having disrupted all sugar production, all cocoa production, and of course stopping the slave trade on the island, they were able to occupy this island for a very long, well, up until 1796. In 1796, the British invaded the island again, of course, because they wanted to control this site. They fought with a complement of, I think, 12,000 men invaded the island. It's a very small island. And the size of the invading force was actually very shocking because one would expect that a smaller regiment could have actually taken over the island. But the British were adamant and they sent in 12,000 troops, including many mercenaries to take over the site. The island, the battle continued for 6 months, and the enslaved Africans eventually lost control of the main fort, Fort Mont Fortune, in May of 1796. This Enniskillen monument was installed in the 1930s. A naval ship, British battleship, came to St. Lucia to memorialize this Enniskillen regiment because they were going to be made defunct. This has sat on the site. It's actually the highest point on the site. So physically, this last British monument dominates the site. I don't think it's by accident because I think it meant that they were installing the memory of this victory on the site. What this means is that when one walks up to the site, what is remembered and what is commemorated is the victory of that specific site. Next slide, please. The monument commemorates the victory of the Irish regiment over the enslaved Africans who had defended the island and their freedom for over 6 months. The victory allowed the enslaved Africans to be re-enslaved from 1796 to 1834. So in other words, this victory, which is commemorated by this monument, reminds us of what had happened to the enslaved Africans. But the British commemorate their victory and nothing. And of course, this monument silences what the Africans had done on that site. So in 1796, when they lost, they were marched out of this fort under flag. And the British were shocked to find out that actually the men who had held them for so long and so skillfully were actually mainly an African army, an army that the French referred to as l'armée de la bois, the French army in the woods. Reinterpretation and representation. The sites need to be reinterpreted as a memorial to the self-liberation ethos, which drove the enslaved Africans to resist enslavement, even against major odds. They fought and defeated the British and only surrendered 6 months after the invasion in 1795. The British had used 12,000 troops, which made it overwhelming. The battle was inevitable, the victory was inevitable for the British. The enslaved Africans fought all the way to the end and refused to accept enslavement. The result of this was that the captured, the Africans who surrendered became prisoners of war, and many of them were shipped to the UK, and a large number of them were used to create the West India Regiment, which was then sent off to West Africa to help in the subjugation of West Africa. So the case we're making here is for this monument, this Enniskillen monument, and the site to be reinterpreted not as a memorial to the British victory, but to the strong spirit of resistance that allowed enslaved Africans to resist and maintain their freedom on this island for such a long period of time. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Phulgence. And next up, we have Dr. Elizabeth Chu.
Thank you, Chardae, and hello, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to be talking this afternoon about an historic site in the US called Montpelier that was the plantation of 3 generations of the family of President James Madison. President Madison was the 4th US president and is known as the father of the US Constitution for his central role in creating the Constitution in the late 1780s. We're located in very rural part of Virginia, about 90 miles south of Washington, D.C. What distinguishes Montpelier from other presidential historic plantation sites is the work that Montpelier staff has done since the 1990s with the descendants of those who were enslaved by the Madisons at Montpelier. Just this past May, the organization that represents the descendants achieved a relationship of structural parity with the Montpelier Foundation board, so that they're sharing power and authority in the governing and running of the site. And we are currently working on achieving structural parity at the staff level as well. I'm going to just give a actually a brief history of the descendant engagement and relationships at Montpelier, and then speak very briefly about the sort of drama of last spring, which resulted in the Descendants organization achieving structural parity. So the descendant engagement at Montpelier began in 1992 when this wonderful woman, Dr. Betty Kearse, came to Montpelier with her family oral history of being descended from James Madison and an enslaved cook. And so the Montpelier is owned by the American National Trust for Historic Preservation, has been open to the public only since 1987, and since 2000 has been co-stewarded with the National Trust by a private foundation that we all work for now. It's called the Montpelier Foundation. So when Dr. Kearse first came to Montpelier in the 90s, the National Trust was still running it. So she established relationships with the National Trust staff, and we have continued to work together with her all, for the last 30 years. And she's today a member of our board of directors. Several years later, the archaeologist at Montpelier announced that they had identified the location of the cemetery of the enslaved. That's the image on the left here, with some of the grave depressions shown with snow in them. And members of the local community who were members of the descendant community came to Montpelier and asked to do a ceremony honoring the ancestors. And these two ladies, Carolyn French and Rebecca Gilmore Coleman, were the community members. And they then created an organization called the Orange County African American Historical Society, which was the first organization that Montpelier collaborated with to work with descendants. So the first project that we did was the restoration of a building that was on the site, but was in a sort of across the road from the main part of the site. And it had been the freedmen's home, the home after the Civil War and emancipation of Rebecca Gilmore Coleman's great-great-grandparents, George and Polly Gilmore, who had been freed from enslavement at Montpelier and built a freedmen's their home across the road, and were able to purchase the property. And the image on the right is how it looks today. This is one of, we think, very few surviving freedmen's homes in its original location that's open to the public. And this was our first project where we worked very closely with members of the Gilmore family on everything from the excavation of the ground to understand the site to talking about furnishing and interpreting it. And that sort of set the stage for the work that we do together following that. This is the opening of the site in 2005. In 2007, there was the first large gathering of the African-American descendants of the enslaved who could trace their connection to Montpelier or the area. And about 125 people came together and had a sort of a reunion and a seminar and a lecture from historian John Hope Franklin. During that visit, there was a lot of restoration work being done on the main house, and some of the descendants group toured the house, and they were looking out over this area that you can see on the left that had been a group of dwellings and work buildings of the domestic enslaved workers, but it was at that point had not been interpreted at all. And a member of the descendant community, Iris Ford, said, well, when I look out here, all I see is dead grass and railroad ties. Where are my people? And that was the impetus for building these timber frame structures to identify the location and the general configuration of these important buildings. And this was the very first time that slavery had been returned visually to the landscape of Montpelier. The most famous person to live in slavery was a man named Paul Jennings, who ran the Montpelier house and was Madison's manservant. And he was literate, wrote a biography, has an amazing story. And a scholar published a biography of him in 2009. His descendants came to Montpelier to tour and then went to the White House as well in Washington. The next project that we did was, this is another building on the property. This was built by a 20th century owner of the property. It's a railroad station, and because it was built in 1910, it was built as a segregated Jim Crow era train station. And we wanted to restore this building and interpret the time period of Jim Crow, the segregated years after emancipation before the civil rights movement. And we worked again with two community members who had been teenagers in Jim Crow, Orange County, Virginia, who shared their family stories and memories of the space and of the time. So this is, we're sort of seeing this cycle of projects. In 2014, the Descendants came back for another meeting and recommended that we reconstruct the buildings beside the main house. Fortunately, that same year received $10 million from David Rubenstein, and were able to start a big project to do that, and also create a major exhibition. So of course, Descendants were involved all along the way in the archaeology and the research and the way that we interpreted the site. Descendants attended conferences with Montpelier staff members to talk about the projects. And when we began to work on the big project to create an exhibition with the David Rubenstein funding, the advisors on that project had two main requests: that we emphasize the humanity of the ancestors and that we not leave slavery in the past. So those were the guiding stars of the project. The exhibition is called The Mere Distinction of Color, and the stories of the enslaved at Montpelier during the Madison ownership are told through the faces and voices and memories and family stories and oral histories of descendants. And we really wanted to work to create the suggestion of human presence in the spaces, to make visitors kind of empathize, think about enslaved people as individuals. And one piece of feedback that we got from a visitor that has stayed with me, he said that the exhibition helped him remember that slavery happened to one person at a time. And that was absolutely what we had been hoping to do. The exhibit won some awards. We followed up the exhibit a year later, the opening of it, by hosting what we call the National Summit on Teaching Slavery. And this meeting of a really wonderful group of people, scholars, descendants from sites all over the Eastern US, and museum professionals, we met for 3 days, and the idea was to create a rubric of best practices for descendant engagement, built on the 3 pillars of historical research, relationship building, and interpretation. So these smart people from all over met for 3 days, and we ended up creating a rubric that has really made an impact in the field of public history and historic sites. This was an article about it in the Association for State and Local Histories magazine in, I think, 2019. And there have been some conference sessions on people using the rubric, and we're even hearing that other kinds of sites, like a site of Japanese internment, reached out and told us that they were using it as well. It was a very important event that happened in June of 2019, when Descendants gathered again the day before Juneteenth. And that gathering was organized by a former colleague, Hannah Scruggs, who is here on Zoom with us, now a PhD student in history at Harvard. This gathering was of critical importance because this is the gathering where the Descendants voted to create their own separate nonprofit organization that would democratically represent them, so that they would now, their organization called the Montpelier Descendants Committee would have the same kind of legal status as the Montpelier Foundation, both a 501c3 nonprofits. And they held a workshop about memorialization in the fall of 2019, because a big goal is to memorialize the cemetery of the enslaved here at Montpelier. So there was total new leadership at Montpelier, new board chair, new president in the beginning of 2020. In the summer of 2021, the board voted to create a relationship of structural parity at the board level of Montpelier with the organization representing the descendants, the Montpelier Descendant Committee. That ran into some difficulties, to say the least, ran into some difficulties moving forward. And just this past March, the board voted to not create structural parity with the democratically elected representatives of the enslaved descendants who had created it, but to decide themselves who the descendants were and go forward that way. Of course, there was a massive protest and uprising. 2 colleagues and I who stood with the descendants and spoke out to the press were fired. There was lots of national press. I just chose Washington Post headlines because they were easy to download. The Montpelier staff created a website and a petition on change.org that got 11,000 signatures. In the middle of May, the full board sort of gave up, and the Descendants Committee was able to create a relationship of structural parity with the remaining board, and that is how we've gone forward. And that has brought me to being the interim president and CEO here. And I think it was quite an episode in museums in the US this spring. So, thanks, everybody.
Wonderful. There is just so much. Yes, please join us and just all this amazing work that we are lucky to hear about today. There's just so many connections between these projects. And one of the things that strikes me, something that I've heard through my own work, right, is this call for a quote unquote authentic history, right? We've seen this play out on our own sites, but we're also seeing, especially in the US, these debates continue to be played out in both the classroom and political forums. So I'm going to start with Dr. Phulgence. Can you tell us what is an authentic history and who decides what's authentic? And we'll go around as you please, jump in, but we'll start with Dr. Phulgence.
Yeah, that's the thing. Authentic history. I think it's a matter of whose history is being told, especially when you're looking at sites of commemoration. Creating a memorial in itself is, in some ways, promoting one history over another. And as soon as you start doing that, the questions start. For example, the site I looked at, the Inniskillen Monument in St. Lucia, is a massive monument on top of a whole lot of history that hasn't been told. Whose history is being told? Yes, it's European British history, but there's a lot more history to be told. So I think the notion of an authentic history is one that could be very dangerous, because it speaks to the problem of a meta-narrative. And I think that's what makes it problematic. I think we should see history as multivocal, and that allows for the kind of inclusivity that I think we're looking for here.
Dr. Chu, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's no mystery to people in the field in the US that the field of historic sites in general, presidential sites in particular, they're very, very largely, predominantly worked at and run by white people. The way that the interpretation of slavery has often happened is it's been really intellectualized and turned into sort of like an academic subject, very much removed from human beings, presented as kind of an abstraction. So the work at Montpelier, beginning 30 years ago with Descendants, I think has enabled us to actually talk about enslavement, tell the stories of the enslaved through the actual authentic stories and eyes of the people whose ancestors lived it and who created this nation as much as James Madison did. The problem is still, we have had wonderful African-American colleagues here, through the years, but, this site is still really, predominantly white, and it's a plantation. Coming to a plantation every day is hard and traumatic for Descendants. And so while the field is kind of developing and changing, I think it's absolutely critical, I think, at every site of enslavement to somehow involve the descendant communities.
Ms. Jennings-Clark, how about you? How are you dealing with these questions, especially through crafts and art forms? Are there any interesting examples as well with the communities that you're working with in St. Lucia, where these questions come up?
Yes, thanks for that question. Well, in my work in the National Trust, this question of telling the broader story of St. Lucia's history is very much a present challenge for us, because as Winston was saying, you know, most of what we have so far celebrates the colonial British and French history, and most of what's written in our books so far also speaks to that. In my work, I come from a community work background, and the community you spoke of earlier, which we pronounce Chazelle, nothing is remotely related to how it looks on paper. But Chazelle is a very interesting community because it is one of the areas where a lot of the what would be our First Nations, the Kalinago and the Arawaks live there, and especially the Kalinago heritage lives on there. And it's a craft community where they have a very interesting socioeconomic system, and there are links to also back to probably Ghanaian pottery in the way the potters work. But we don't, you know, I know that, some people know that, and that's kind of where it ends. So we don't have it in even the teachings in the schools in that area. And of course, I mean, I'm the minority in St. Lucia. You know, the majority of the population, 95% or so, is of Black African and some Indian descent. So, you know, you're talking about the vast majority of the people's history not really being represented very well. And you know, one of the interesting things I find as I work with the Chazelle crafters over the years is they themselves don't see their cultural heritage as in the crafts as that important. So even though I'm fairly close to some of the people and I speak often with them, and they've told me many things about how they do what they do, every time I go down, I find out something new that they didn't think was important enough, you know, to say. The last time was this lovely song, which I can't sing and I won't even try, but it was a song to call the wind for the firing of the pots, the clay pots. And, you know, these are the type of things also that we're really at a point where we're going to risk losing our heritage, because there are no younger generation who are interested in following this tradition. So, you know, it speaks to many kind of different levels of the value or lack thereof of these histories. So that's it in a nutshell from me. Okay.
Well, yeah, and I think this really highlights just how colonial narratives still are such in control across the board of so many histories globally, right? Not just in the US. But all of your work really highlights the importance of collaboration and how heritage can contribute to community empowerment and maybe even decolonization, right? What new understandings did you and your collaborators come to through these community-centered practices? How has this type of collaborative work transformed you? And how does engaging descendant communities change the interpretation of slavery? And Elizabeth, let's start with you, because I think you left us with a lot of food for thought with that presentation.
Yeah, so I've been here now for 7 years at Montpelier, and I realize that when I had been completely, I'll use the word guilty, of some of the things that I just said, of, you know, presenting slavery in a way that intellectualized it and didn't make it about human beings. And I realized that what other sites do isn't the same as what Montpelier has been doing. There was a panel at Juneteenth, on Juneteenth at Monticello, where Dr. Michael Blakey was on a panel, and he talked about how there's real shared power, and then there's performative nonsense. And we're, of course, nothing is perfect. Everyone has a long way to go, but I realized here that the level of relationships, both professional, collaborative, but also personal, that this kind of work brings, this has really been the absolute highlight of my professional and personal life. I mean, it's really been a profound experience.
Yeah, would any of the other panelists like to jump in on this question?
Well, for us, I think we're a little behind. Our narratives are just starting to change. I think the consciousness is just starting to develop. The descendant community is still in very much, how do I put this? We still need to provide the information that would ignite the type of consciousness, I think, that would start informing a broader movement. As Finola said, there has been history that is not being taught in schools, in primary schools especially. History of St. Lucia is not being taught. And what it has allowed is that we have a perpetuation of the colonial narratives. So most times you will hear St. Lucia was 7 times British, 7 times French. The question is, when was it St. Lucian? And without the type of data, type of information that would be spread out in the wider society, we have not been able to get to the point where we are just about to get to the point where we can get descendant communities to be directly involved in those type of activities, which I think is already being done here in the US. So we're a little behind the curve on this one. Hopefully we can get there as quickly as possible. With those examples that we're seeing here, definitely we can inspire some kind of movement in that direction. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yes, there is still so much work to do, as we've seen. And again, I think the rubric, especially here locally in Virginia, but also nationally, has been such a important driving force to changing many narratives across these sites. So again, another important resource for us all to familiarize ourselves with if we haven't had a chance to yet. So as we think about one of today's themes, which is global shared heritage, how do you see the transatlantic slave trade fitting into global shared heritage narratives? On such an enormous scale, how might we think global, how might thinking globally influence the ways different communities think about their relationships to the transatlantic slave trade? And how do these relationships impact the way you research, interpret, and teach these narratives? And I will just throw that question out there. Please jump in. And again, feel free to kind of ask each other back and forth as well. We'll converse.
Can I jump in?
Sure. And I think Elizabeth, you were muted, but we'll start with Winston.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, let Elizabeth go ahead. Go ahead.
Elizabeth?
Oh, sorry. Sorry. So one of the partnership that the International Association of National Trusts, having put together this international group of sites in the US, the Caribbean, and Africa that interpret slavery and various aspects of the slave trade, that has actually been incredibly eye-opening to me and helpful, for the purpose of just meeting professionals and colleagues all over the place, but also in historic plantations in Virginia, the time period that we interpret are from the mid-18 teens until the mid-1830s. And we don't really think about the slave trade because the people that we interpret who were enslaved had been here for many generations. But I think it is incredibly important that never to forget about how, the colonial context and how this all started, because this is what built the United States.
Great, and also other colonial powers, right, throughout the world, how important the slave trade was to the economic development of so many different places. Winston, if you'd like, please go ahead and jump in here.
I think the global study of this thing is necessary because we spend so much time in silos, and that's why different groups are ahead in different ways, and still other groups are still dealing with issues that one would think would have been dealt with a long time ago. But if we look at the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, as this force which created the Atlantic world as we know it today, and the legacies that it created, I think we have a better chance of understanding our relationship, because the silos denies us this opportunity to see ourselves as a global entity, especially around this North Atlantic space, which I think is being, because of language, of course, the colonial legacy still continues. We have barriers with the languages and so on. But I think studying this, the impact of this force in the creation of the Atlantic world allows us to do a much better job of understanding who we are, where we are, and how we're moving forward within this global space that we're in today.
All right, well, I think I have time for one more question before we turn it over to our audience and hear from some of you and really get this conversation going. But I want to gear this next question to Finola. You have created and taught so many interesting creative approaches in St. Lucia. What have you and your collaborators learned from this type of multidisciplinary research? And how have these creative approaches promoted meaningful dialogue and understanding between heritage professionals and descendant communities? I think that story, about the song is one that is so powerful. But what other takeaways have you and your collaborators come to through this engagement?
Sadly, I have to say nowhere near what we would like. I think we're literally at the beginning of understanding how deep an issue we have to deal with. So I see in the comments that somebody said, could it be that young St. Lucians of African descent are not interested because of not being taught the history? And yes, so it's very much even when you start to talk about valuing and placing this on a higher level of integration into things like school curricula and that, there's a lot of not just resistance, but pushback on it, because people kind of, there's still this thought that that's not the proper thing that we need to be learning about. And so for me, I mean, as far as my work primarily in Chazelle goes, is yes, we've uncovered a few starting points, but we struggle when it comes to actually getting the support from any corner, whether it's the people themselves in Chazelle who are living in a lot of cases on a subsistence level, or the government in terms of putting resources behind this, or independent donors who could perhaps make a difference, to taking something from a theoretical project that was written, to something that's really gone back now and really integrated the community and taken that very time-consuming and intense approach of building from the ground up. And although I've done a lot of interesting things, I have to say they're all very short projects that never take the work anywhere close to where it needs to be.
Yes, there's always more room to build. And again, a lot of this project, right, this type of work is relationship building when it comes down to it. So it takes time, it takes patience, and it takes a lot of effort. So I am now going to turn it over back to Elva to open it up to community comments. And I see we have a few things in the chat, but I think Elva has a little bit more for us.
You're on mute, Elva.
All right, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Relative to them garnering a greater appreciation of the crafts that you spoke about, Finola, the first thing that came to mind for me is perhaps educating them or exposing them to others whose crafts have been really amplified. I think about the women of Gee's Bend, and also the, of course, the Gullah Geechee people who do the beautiful basket weaving. And so when they see others, and sometimes it helps to perhaps expose them to the fact that these things can be monetized. And so when they see people like them who are also gifted, who've passed down these very special gifts, I think that, that may go a long ways in that, and speaking to that. In speaking to getting the history for everyone, and I'll be brief, it's important to, first of all, have cultural competence. One of the things I found to be true over the last 20 years is when you're acquiring oral history interviews, you've got to do your due diligence before you even record people to get the most out of them. And a quick example of that are the Wpa Slave Narratives. They vary widely. We already know that from state to state, from people to people. However, there are people who were especially effective, people like Susie Bird or Professor Cooper, who was actually a chemistry professor at Hampton University, in getting sometimes the deepest things from people. So cultural competence and the ability to empathize, I think, are important, but oral history interviews are going to be vital in acquiring, the histories of all people, if you will, more effectively. Also, lastly, in talking about the slave trade, one thing that I found is important is to talk about experiences versus data and statistics. What I found over and over again is that when you marry powerful storytelling with sound scholarship, it results in public history at its finest. So when I talk about the slave trade, I have a project called Tales from the Coffle, documents illustrative of the slave trade in Central Virginia. I don't talk about statistics. I get right into narratives and primary and secondary documents that people rarely see, and also the genealogical components of those things. So those are things that I just wanted to share based on experience, and I yield back my time.
Yes, so many important sources there to consider, especially thinking about the oral histories too. I'm a member, a board member of the African American Historical Society of Newport News, and for the last couple of years, we've been trying to get an oral history project off the ground because so many important stories, especially through COVID, we are losing them rapidly. So again, cultural competence, but also training, right? Training is a very, very important part of all of this work. And I think, again, we're happy to highlight some of the work too, Elva, that you're doing. So thank you for sharing. So now we'll move to Jerome, who I believe has a comment or question.
Good evening. I've heard so many great things, and I don't know where to even start, but I'll have to say something that when we talk about history from another country, we have to stop and look at first Virginia especially. And I heard a man say that all of his life he had seen the Lee statues and never paid attention to them, until now they start pulling them down and what they simply meant. The Virginia song that they used to sing, I'm not from Virginia, but when I heard carry me back to old Virginia where the darkies do something, I was like shocked that that would be a state song. I taught African-American literature for 7 years at high school. And and I think Mr. Jenkins alluded to the fact that, children don't know what they're not being taught. And the things that I told them and I taught them for those years, they would go off to college and come back and say, Mrs. Selden, I cannot believe that professor said they, were just shocked at the things that I had taught them that nobody else had taught them. And even their parents, when they mentioned certain things to their parents, the parents would say, but I thought you knew. And they would say, you never told me. So it's so many of our pieces of our history. When I go back to Winston, and I hope I'm not insulting you, but calling by your first name, but even in this country, there's so many things that we have not done as a people to encourage our children, the generations behind us, to really appreciate those who went before us and the folk who fought. It's almost like in our history, you never heard that Black folk who were enslaved fought to get their freedom. It's almost like they were always happy campers. And so it's so many things I wanted to say, but I can't say it. I don't want to take too much time, but I have thoroughly enjoyed this. I appreciate this. Thank you.
All right, let's hear from Bill Wiggins and the important work that is being done in Hampton. Bill, would you like to share? I don't know if you're still here.
Pardon my tardiness. I'm moving along. I'm not what I used to be. I'm not what I'm going to be. In looking at Freedom's first generation and the significance, as my former colleague Bob Ings pointed out, the contraband communities in Hampton provided a model for other areas where enslavement had existed. Unfortunately, it didn't last, as we know. But while it was moving along, there was economic development, political involvement, African Americans, because they were African Americans by then, not just Africans in America. The descendants of the contraband are all around us, and the Contraband Historical Society embraces them. And we were formulated somewhere around 1998. And we're trying to go strong, and we have descendants of contrabands all around us. And I dare say that much of what Hampton, Virginia is today is owing in part to those descendants and those contraband. And I'm learning more and more about them. If you go out to Fortress Monroe, we know that their footprints are everywhere. And we have had many luminaries like William Roscoe Davis, Tulani Davis's great-great-grandfather. I can go on and on. I'm not going to belabor this though, because don't let a historian start speaking. Superintendent Dance is smiling, is saying, cut it, Bill, that's enough. But come on out to Fortress Monroe tomorrow. We're gonna cut up, we're gonna have a good time. Again, I'm a mellowing historian, back from my hyperbaric chamber treatment today, so my brain is foggy. So bless you all. Thank you for a wonderful program.
Yes.
Signing off.
All right.
Bye-bye.
So thankful for you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill. And as Bill mentioned, there is so much amazing programming this weekend at Fort Monroe. Eola, would you like to briefly discuss the rest of the weekend?
Yes, I will share just quickly because I would love for others to be able to make any further comments. We have we're commemorating 403 years of African-American history in English North America with the African Landing Day, a program founded by Calvin Pearson and Project 1619, an organization that's been around since the 1990s. And we will start at 10 a.m. here at Point Comfort, Fort Monroe in present-day Hampton, with a ceremony led by the Fort Monroe Authority. And we welcome you to see where the African Landing Memorial will be located. There will be a blessing of the land by Chief Keith Anderson of the Nansman Indian tribe, as well as other comments from officials of Hampton. And we hope that you will join us for that. We'll then procession to the main program, which will start at 11 at Continental Park. So those of you who are familiar with the gazebo adjacent to the Chamberlain, we call it the bandstand today. You will see the program there. And we welcome Dr. Gloria Brown Marshall, a scholar of law and Virginia history, to provide keynote comments. The program is followed by a bell ringing ceremony at noon, and then a rose petal ceremony honoring the ancestors of the Middle Passage. We end the day with a concert, and we welcome back Delphio Marsalis. He began a concert last year that was interrupted with a storm, a thunderstorm, a lightning storm. Lightning would end the program. And so we are so pleased that he joined us again this year. And for those of you who enjoy Louisiana music, particularly the second line tradition, you know that oftentimes when we're honoring a life, but there are also some aspects of it that are celebratory. And so we welcome them back. Sunday is Healing Day at Fort Monroe. And so we will start with 6 a.m. sunrise ceremony with Cameroonian Queen Mothers. And this is one of the most transformative experiences I've ever had in my life and at Fort Monroe. So if I see you there, I promise it is something that is special. Following, we will walk 3.1 miles and just really fellowship and talk and share. My colleague Ajena Rogers has prepared something special for you all. And we will close with a drummer's circle. And I see several of my friends from Washington, D.C. who are familiar with the drummer's circle at Malcolm X Park there. And so this is really just for community. It's, the drumming tradition is so special, and we wanted to create this space for that. So we do hope we see you. The final event is virtual. You can join from your home. It is restorative yoga and meditation. It's open to all levels because we just really wanted to think about the whole person. It's not, especially for our descendant communities and for the practitioner, those of us who are in the records, doing this work, making sure we're also taking care of ourselves. So thank you, Chardae. I have been so blessed to work with so many amazing people like Chardae, like Thelonious Cook with the 1619 Fest and Thundercloud Edible Forest, like Phyllis Terrell with Fort Monroe Authority, and Yuri Mulligan here with Hampton, the city of Hampton and her team. I see Mahogany, who I met today. And so many of you. And it is, just a privilege to do this work. I see a couple of folks who I wondered if you wanted to make comment, and I'm looking to Vedet to see if there's time for that.
Yes, you have time.
Awesome, because we have a couple of scholars who are on the line. And so if you wanted to raise your hand, if you didn't get a chance to send me a note to say that you would like to make comment today, we hope that you will do so. And if not, then I will turn things back over to Chardae for a few more questions, and then Vedet and I will close out.
Yes, we have a number of active scholars in this community, and also several Descendant community members that have been really engaged in this work for decades. So if you do have a comment or a question, please either raise your hand or send Eola a note, and we will get you on here. Oh, okay, we already have one. So Dr. Trina Coleman.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to participate and to learn a lot about some of the things I did not know. Even hear about the contraband society in Hampton. I'm a 7th, 8th generation Hamptonian. Holes still in my legacy as far as filling in some of the gaps. Trying to figure out, this is an interesting little tidbit I have shared with Superintendent Nance. The records for the building of Fort Calhoun, now Fort Wool. Record number 137 is Shepard Mallory. Right under Shepard Mallory's name is record 138, Robert Tabb, which happens to be the name of my great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather. I do not know if it's the same Robert Tabb or not, but I am going to see if there's anybody here who can help me fill that gap in. But one of the things I want to say is that I teach physics at HBCUs, at Bowie I've taught, and right now I'm teaching at Virginia Union. But one of the things I put into my lessons is cultural relevance. And I bring back something to make the students excited about physics and physical science. I talk about the Hootie, I talk about the Shango bone, the Lobombo bone, and make sure that they understand that the heritage of mathematics belongs to our people. Although Belgian, the Shango bones in Belgium, and Russia has the Rhine papyruses and things like that. We know colonization stole everything that was important about how innovative we are and have been as a people. So those are my comments. I also want to shout out to my mentor colleague, Miss Hattie Harwell, who runs a museum as well. She has the Maya Science Village in Oakland, California, Museum of African American Technology. And so she brings together innovations and things, inventions, and information that African Americans have done here and accomplished in the States. And so I just want to say thank you for this amazing panel.
Wonderful. I even see on here a long distant family member of my own, Miss Vini Coleman, who is, Vini Ashton, who is doing some really amazing work in the Northern Neck. And I think one of the themes that we're seeing here today, right, is the importance of family histories and telling these stories, right, these descendant stories. I want to turn it back to the panelists for a moment while we wait for any additional comments or questions. What family histories have you been engaged with through this process? You know, we have the stories at Montpelier of the many generations, right, of not just the white family there, but the descendant families, right, of the enslaved. And similarly in St. Lucia, right, how there's these British and French stories that tend to overburden these personal and local family stories. So how are you using these to transform, again, the ways that these sites are being interpreted, and who's engaged with you on a daily basis with this?
So I mentioned the name of Paul Jennings, who was enslaved by the Madisons, whose mother was enslaved by the Madisons. And because he had direct access to the Madisons and all of their friends and visitors, and was literate and figured out how to get his own freedom, not because of James or Dolly, wrote an autobiography in his own lifetime, very, very very well documented. So he's, by far an outlier. Obviously, most people stories are not easy to get at all. We have a project called the Naming Project, where we are every person that we have documented as being enslaved at Montpelier, whether we even know their whole name, our staff members are creating whatever kinds of biographies that we can, and we're sharing them via social media and our website. And if I have enough sense, I'll put a link in the chat. But it's this, this is documentary research that's been going on for now 25 years, and archaeological research. This is a long process to actually fill out the stories beyond the ones that are more obvious and easy to get hold of. But having the level of knowledge and detail of the whole community of people who made this place work, and being able to share anything we can about them as human beings is really important to our interpretation.
Well, with reference to the St. Lucian context, I think like almost every enslaved society, that break where one is unable to go back beyond a certain point to develop any kind of history, I think is one that's common throughout the entire African diaspora. In St. Lucia, for example, and a lot of the Anglophone Caribbean countries, slave names weren't supposed to be recorded or legally required until 1815. What it meant was that until that time, no one had a name, at least not a recorded name. And we've only just started beginning to develop narratives when we found names. For example, recently, August 1st, we celebrated emancipation. And an enslaved woman's story was told only because we were able to get the dossier, the legal dossier, which only developed because by that time laws had been passed ensuring that punishment was actually recorded. And this woman actually died from her punishment. She was in the stock. And because the law had been passed, there was an investigation where everything about her life on the plantation, which led to her death, had to be recorded. The planter wasn't pleased about it, but it had to be recorded. And we've only now been able to gather these documents to create these narratives. So we're at the point where we're just starting to gather these documents, because before 1815, people had, legally, there was no name and no document to be able to try to develop a connection going all the way back. So we go all the way to 1815, and that's where it stops.
Yeah, and just another difficulty, right, of doing this research. So much of the historic archive, right, was recorded in racist terms, where we're lucky enough, especially when we think about locally and the Tidewater region, and looking to the 17th century especially, but even later, there are so few names that we find in the documents, right? So using the archives to sort of look between the lines and try to fulfill and do justice to the humanity of these enslaved people is so important. And Elva, I know you have a really exciting research project happening that will be debuting soon that I hope you will discuss, but I will let you make your comment or question now as well.
Okay, I just wanted to thank you for allowing me to be a part of this, and I wanted to quickly invite everyone, since I'm Richmond-based, to the new exhibition. It's the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia's 40th anniversary exhibition, and I'm blessed to be the curator researcher for it. There are over 1,000 items, and we cover before freedom came, and it's titled, I should say, Forging Freedom, Justice and Equality, a survey of the history of the Black experience. And you're going to see some very rare things on display that have never been seen before. I'll give you just one nugget. The Burial Ground Society of the Free People of Color of the City of Richmond was founded in 1815. And they're the only known repository to have a ledger that belonged to that group. And it covers the years between 1844 and 1858. And you see a lot of notables. And so that's why I love speaking about the free Black experience, because believe it or not, a lot of people aren't cognizant of the fact that not everyone was enslaved. So there are many highlights. And one of the things that's special to me, and then I'll promise I'll start, is the powerful stories and photographs from early HBCUs of Virginia. So we have artifacts from St. Paul's, we have, of course, Virginia Union, and another quick nugget, how many people realize that Union at one point had a law school? And so I bring forth things like that. And we talk about so much today, health equity and social determinants of health. Those things are covered under organizations in the Black press. So please come out if you get a chance. It should be mid-September before things get started. I would love to give people personal tours if you let me know when you're coming. And thank you for allowing me to share that.
Yes, we are so looking forward to that grand opening and the exhibit. And I do have one more comment that I'm going to throw to. But before I do that, I did see a comment that is near and dear to my heart. The Lemon Project and William & Mary College this past spring finally unveiled the Hearth Memorial, which is an incredible memorial to set eyes on and to just interact with. Again, thinking about names and the exhaustive work that took place over years to find so many of our ancestors in the Tidewater region. If you have not yet, please do yourself a favor and make it down to campus. And I know students at William & Mary now, especially Black and multicultural organizations, are thinking carefully about how we want to use these spaces. So again, this is another important part of this work, right? Is once we build it, again, how are we going to utilize it as well? Well, I'm going to turn it now to Dr. Joseph Jones for the final comment of today.
Okay. Thanks, Chardae. I was sitting here looking at, trying to find my little hand raise thing, and not sure what's going on with Zoom, but thank you and greetings, everyone. I apologize for only now coming on. We're over at the site at First Baptist Church where they're doing the excavations now. We're actually working on the ancestral human remains there, and so we got. We were there a little longer than planned. I'd hoped to join you at the beginning, but and I can't get ahead of what we share with the community, the recognized descendant community. But that work is moving ahead, and today it's not a spoiler, I don't think, to say that today we were able to collect the sample, a DNA, a sample that will be used for DNA analysis from the third individual, and we've been able to do that for all three individuals so far. So I think in the spirit of community engagement, this has been a project that has gone extremely well. Are working with Jack Gary over at Colonial Williamsburg, the director of archaeology there, and through the Institute for Historical Biology under Dr. Michael Blakey here at William & Mary. And so we're really excited about this project, this program, and we're training students to do community engaged research. So meaning that we share with community all of the options available to them, including no analysis, including the possibility of having no skeletal analysis and simply respectful memorialization and reburial of remains, all the way up to what we're doing here, doing chemical and DNA analysis and so forth, per the wishes of the community. And so we'll have more to share on that, as I alluded to earlier, once we've briefed, debriefed the descendant community. But please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to share, whatever it is that we can about the project. But yeah, and we should be, meeting soon with the descendant community within the next month or two to give them preliminary findings and to receive their instructions as to how they would like to proceed. Or do we go on to excavate more excavations, or do these 3 individuals stand in as representative? And then we start thinking about proper reburial and memorialization. So yeah, happy to again to address any questions or comments folks might have. Chardae knows how to reach me. She can give you my email or cell number. I'm happy to speak to anyone about that project.
Yeah, if that's okay, Joe, I will paste it in the chat for folks to reach out to you. And please keep your eyes out as well. First Baptist Church in Colonial Williamsburg have also hosted a number of public meetings related to the Nassau Street excavation. And they are pretty regular from what I remember, at least every few months, I believe, especially as this information comes out and we learn more and more about the cemetery and the long history, right, of First Baptist, the historic First Baptist Church of Williamsburg. Well, I think this has been a really, really productive conversation. I thank so many of you for sharing your thoughts and your questions. Please take a look at the chat if you have not yet. You can see it keeps moving up and down as people paste in more information about local programs, national programs, all sorts of really interesting and engaging work that's happening, especially here in the US, but even the globe. So with that, I will turn it over to Eola for closing comments.
Well, thank you so much, Chardae, to Dr. Chu, Dr. Phulgence, as well as Ms. Jennings Clark. We appreciate you all so much. Again, I cannot say thanks enough to the Association of African American Museums. Being able to partner in this way is very unique to membership, but it also has to do with just the passion and commitment you all have to museums, historic sites, and community organizations, and of course, people of African descent around the world. And so I just have incredible thanks to be part of this community of practice. And so with that, I turn it over to Dr. Coleman-Robinson to close us out and share about how we hope that this is a community and that we continue to stay engaged.
I don't really think I have anything else to say after you just closed out everything, Eola. Thank you for taking the helm and doing my work for me. But I would really like to thank each and every one of you for coming out today and sharing your afternoon with us, as I said at the top of whatever hour we started. And I would also like to thank the panelists just for being so amazing. And not just sharing your story about the work that you do, but your personal stories. Those are the things that allow us all to connect in the field and show that we're human, showing the fact that, we're growing over time, and then, we're growing as individuals, and then also in our field of studies. So thank you so much. And then thank you for listening to your respective communities about what should be implemented in your work. That's really important. Some people don't like to hear the truth, and they don't want it, interpreted on their sites. So thank you for being brave and just doing what's right, and showing that folks were there. There were enslaved people on your grounds, and they should be remembered. So thank you. I'm not going to bore you with all of my background, but nobody wanted to shout out Virginia State University on that great old 95, which is an HBCU, so I'm going to do it. I am a graduate of Virginia State University, so and they don't pay me to say anything, but I just feel like I should in this space with all these Virginians. So thank you so much for allowing me to shout out my HBCU, but I love HBCUs around the globe. I'm trying to see who else is in the chat shouting out their HBCUs, but they haven't done it yet. And since I'm like the Wizard of Oz, I'm going to go ahead and shut it down so nobody else says anything. But I appreciate all of you for coming out and just being phenomenal. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And we will see you later.